So, I mean, to me, it's actually a very interesting and amazing time to be ushering in a new class on the heels of this type of historic moment in the U.S. economy. But one of the things that I want to do is I want to both put that in context of a couple of other issues and talk to you about how our business school is set up to actually be a part of that conversation, but also put it in a little bit of historical context. Because as a social scientist, I often have a little bit of frustration that we think of things in such a fundamentally here and now way of idealizing what the current moment is and not thinking about what the long-term historical trends are that have led to this moment, or thinking about the future. And so there are a couple of things that I want to just think about as we move forward in this conversation. The first thing is that this is a historic moment. The United States has risen over the course of the 20th century to be far and away the most powerful economic, but also military and general geopolitical force within the global economy. It is no surprise that the U.S. downgrading of debt has such major implications for global markets because the United States is so fundamentally in a power position in that entire system, even if our power is declining even as we speak. So to think about what that actually means, just thinking about what it means to have an intersection of politics and economics is really a fundamental part of what we want to engage in and teach and think about very deeply. And that is the moment that we're sitting in today. You cannot separate, whether it is the case that S&P is trying to cover its ass by making decisions about the S&P downgrading because it did such a poor job throughout the 2000s in thinking about credit overall. That may be true, but it's also very true that parties that come together and think deeply about how our economy should be structured also have to work together in this hallowed notion that we think of as democracy, that we are the greatest pinnacle of democratic achievement in the world, but we've also in some ways become somewhat of a dysfunctional political system. And so it's very, very important to actually think about what the implications of that issue are. The second issue that becomes very important, of course, is on the heels of that, which has to do with not just the credit agencies themselves, because it wasn't just that the credit agencies were stupid, it was that they were a revolving door for Washington. Right? It has always been the case that we have politicians who move from politics to the SEC, to Wall Street, and back again, and these types of processes actually have fundamental consequences for how the people that are assessing these instruments think about their futures, because they themselves often want jobs, and that conflict of interest is a big problem within this system. But you can even go a little deeper and put this more along in a place that hits home for you. I don't know if you all remember the name Fabrice Tour. Does anybody remember his name? Right? He was a trader that was made famous in the Goldman Sachs discussions a couple of years ago. He was an individual who was about your age, maybe a couple years older, and was in the process of actually thinking through how to build these complex financial instruments. But he, like many of the other students that we have pushed out in business schools, went out into the world knowing very, very technical aspects of how to build instruments and build securitization markets, but didn't think about the broader social context in which they were embedded. Or even if they did think about it, they were in firms that didn't want them to think about it because they wanted them to actually just focus on making money because it was all going to be okay in the end. Now, I've had a very funny experience over the course of the last 4 or 5 years of going through this with freshmen in business school courses, and when you explain to them the entire process, you get these quizzical answers and these quizzical questions from 18-year-olds who say, "Professor, how can that be? None of that makes sense. Why would you actually create a system that has such perverse incentives?" And you have to scratch your head and wonder how the most powerful minds in economic thinking in the 20th century allowed that to happen. And then there's a second layer of this, which is also really important, which has to do with the ways in which we are fundamentally intertwined in the global economy. There's no way that we can disembed ourselves from that system. The fact today that China can question whether or not we have our fiscal house in order is a fascinating twist on this entire dynamic. Now, this isn't just happening today. This has actually been happening over the course of the last 18 months, I would say. that China has been flexing its muscles in terms of political power and has actually been taking a position in the global scene and saying, listen guys, we are the #1 holders of your debt. Not only that, but we hold the most cash reserves. We control your economic fate. So you better start thinking more deeply about how you operate politically, because the entire system, the entire global economy is us working together, and you actually have to think more deeply about how to get your fiscal house in order. That's a fascinating twist of fate. 3 years ago, we couldn't have imagined a situation in which we would be hearing from China that we are fundamentally, fiscally, and politically irresponsible. How can that twist of fate have happened? Another twist of fate, which is kind of interesting today, and most people don't realize, is that one of the ironies of our time is that we, as the pinnacle of capitalism in the global economy, have become one of the less business-friendly systems in the world. How is it that today the largest communist society in the world is a more business-friendly place than the largest capitalist economy? Those are all very interesting questions, and they take us from issues of the interdependency of the global economy to internationalism and how we think about the countries around the world, to issues of ethics and social responsibility. Now, to actually take a step back, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, one of the things that often frustrates me is that we don't think deep enough historically about how these systems came to be. And it's an important question because it's not just about how the U.S. economy came to be, it's also an important question about how business schools came to be. Because make no mistake about it, we have been a part of this problem. Business schools are the most important major in the country. It's the most popular undergraduate major in the country. Professional schools, it is one of the largest in the country, and if you add in the specialized masters, it is the largest force in professional schools. But in the 80s and 90s, we weren't doing our jobs. And how we actually come to terms with that and think about what we want to be for the future, to me, is the most important question. So let me just take a brief tangent into history, and then we'll dive into what this school is about. I like to, in some ways, mark the beginning of this transformation on September 13th, 1970. Milton Friedman, who died a couple of years ago in 2006, he was a Nobel laureate. I don't know if it registered with people of this generation just how important this man was for the 20th century. But make no mistake about it, along with John Maynard Keynes, Milton Friedman was the most important voice in economic thinking over the course of the 20th century. He shaped the world that we live in today. And in 1970, he made a very, very stark claim. And it was a claim that he'd been making for more than a decade, but it was his moment to actually enter into his second phase of his career, which is the popular moment, the public figure moment. He had a front cover article in the New York Times Magazine, which basically laid the groundwork for shareholder capitalism. He said, businesses have no business thinking about issues of social responsibility. Instead, all we need to think about is profits and shareholder value. That is all that matters. Let's let these other things, other institutions handle these issues. But businesses really need to think about business. So there was a little bit of a funny irony within that, because of course he was a major proponent and probably the biggest force in the global economy for the downsizing of government, but he fundamentally believed that the market would take care of all of these issues. He ushered in the stage of shareholder capitalism. Now in the 80s, of course, that became popularized and personified in movies like Wall Street and personalities like Gordon Gekko, but make no mistake about it, it was very real. It was a very real mindset that was driven by neoclassical economic theory, which basically said, we have no interest in the social implications of what we're doing. All we care about is profits and shareholder value. Right now, I am not here to say that shareholder value is not important. In fact, as a person, as a dean of a business school, it would be irresponsible for me to say such. But it is fundamentally important to think that our responsibilities don't end there. Our responsibilities are to society, because corporations are the most privileged institutions in the global economies, maybe with the one exception of nation states. These organizations have the most power, the most latitude, the most ability to make decisions, and the most protection from law. And so when we send our young people out into those worlds, into those institutions, we have a responsibility to remind you that you are in a very privileged place in society, and it is your responsibility then to actually go into that world and be responsible citizens and think about your embeddedness in society. Right? Now, we could even take this history lesson back to the Depression and the National Labor Relations Act and the Wagner Amendment, and all of that stuff is interesting, but my main message to you today is that the world from the 1970s to the 1980s really embraced this notion that we could completely disembed ourselves from societies, and business schools followed suit. Business schools ran down that road too. And you know what happened? I mean, Fabrice Tour was the first example that I just brought up a few minutes ago, but let's go back to 2000, 2001. If you've ever seen the movie The Smartest Guys in the Room, there are the same individuals in that Enron movie that are the Fabrice Tours of a decade earlier. Right? And we have continually taken the position that we don't have to think about those issues. Now, 2 years ago, I started thinking about what my future in academia was going to be like. And my fantasy was to actually be a part of institution building that was not just about teaching people these issues in the classroom, but was about building an institution that was willing to engage in these topics and willing to handle them head on. And so what would the ideal position in that be? First of all, it would be to build a business school that was fundamentally around embeddedness. Right? If neoclassical economic theory and business schools following suit worked to disembed business schools from the social responsibilities and from the political systems in which they were positioned, the ideal situation would be to re-embed them. Actually teach students to fundamentally think about how everything they do is connected to politics, and society, and to culture, and all of the things that are the messy aspects of society that are very difficult to analyze but are very important for what we think about in terms of how economies run. And so re-embedding business schools to me is not just important because it's interesting, it's important because it matters for the future. But then what else would we want to do? We'd want to build a business school around the issues of ethics and leadership. We would want to not shy away from the question. It's actually a very interesting thing about business schools over the last 20 years. Business schools, and especially the last 10 since the accounting standards of 2000, 2001, they've thought a lot about this question of ethics, and almost every business school has backed away from the idea about whether we should be teaching ethics. There are lots of working around the perimeter. So we have business and society courses, or we have leadership and corporate accountability courses. But almost every business school has decided we shouldn't be teaching ethics, that's not our business. But it is our business. Actually, we need business schools to step up and say, this is what we are about, because ethics and leadership in these privileged positions in society is fundamental to how our society is going to function in the future. We would also need a business school that thinks about sustainability and social responsibility. It's an interesting question to me. As a China scholar, I get asked all the time, why is it that China is surging ahead of us in renewable energy? That's actually a really interesting thing, because we have the best technology. All of the technology comes from the United States. But our renewable energy position is at best third in the global economy. China is far out in front. A bunch of European countries, mostly Germany, are out in second place, and we are lagging way behind. Why? Because we don't have the right understanding for how to build industries in this country anymore. We used to. When we were building the automobile industry in the 50s and the 60s, we had a very good sense of actually how to give subsidies to oil industries, how to build roads, how to actually think about cross-industry strategizing. We did that very well. We're not doing it well today. And it's because of this deadlock that's happening in Washington, D.C. and in the political system more generally. And so we would need a business school that thinks broadly about how to build industries and how to build sustainable, renewable energy systems. Right? And so that's actually a crucial thing that I think is a part of the future of business schools. And finally, we would need a business school that is really built on embeddedness in the global economy. One that doesn't just think about internationalism light, but really thinks deeply about how to become deeply embedded in different parts of the world. What's our relationship to China? And how do we actually understand deeply what that country is about? And how do we help our students understand it? And what's the future of infrastructural development in Africa? And how are countries around the world going to deal with issues of food, water, renewable energy, sustainability across all of these issues that are going to create major stresses in the global economic system. And so when I came here a year ago, we started thinking deeply about all of these issues. Now, thankfully, I inherited a school in which I have many colleagues who have already thought deeply about these. Dean Riddle is one of many colleagues who is very passionate about these issues and just as passionate about them as I am. But building a business school that asks not just how do we create a new cohort of MBAs, but actually asks how do we create a new cohort of MBAs who are going to change the world is really what I wanted to be a part of. And that is what we're doing. Now, the big kicker, the cherry on the top, is that there's no place it would be better to do this than 6 blocks from the White House, across the street from the World Bank and the IFC and the IMF, 12 blocks from Congress, in the biggest economy in the world. Right? That is a fantasy. And this is what we're doing. We don't do this without you. We chose you and you chose us. We chose to become a part of a partnership, to go on a journey that is not going to just be about teaching you the functional areas of business, which are all very important, and you will get great educations in areas like finance and management and leadership and marketing and decision sciences. But we are also going to be on a path to changing the world. I don't just want you to graduate from here and think, how can I make a living? I want you to think, how can you make a difference? And hopefully the system that we've constructed and the curriculum and all of the activities that we put together will help you think through that and help you be as passionate about that as we are. So let me just end by saying welcome. I'm so happy to be welcoming this class and so happy to be a part of this journey and this partnership with you. And I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague.